So yes, it is my absolute. Ooh, here we go. Right, get this one up. To introduce Bethany Cole, who is a PhD student at the University of Arkansas studying medieval literature. Having previously earned a master's in English literature and a bachelor's in philosophy, her scholarly interests are broadly centered on the intersection of literature, theology, and philosophy. More recently, these interests have focused on the literature of the early Middle Ages, especially tales from England, Ireland, and Wales. Her thesis work is focused on speculative theology in Irish literature, focusing on medieval theories of time, metaphysics, and eschatology. Eschatology. It's like phenomenology. Takes a bit to get out. As they were imaginatively explored in mythological dress. Bethany, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Hi, welcome. Okay, so we can see you, we can hear you. Do you have a PowerPoint that you're sharing for us?
I do. Let me get that pulled up here. Can you see that?
We can indeed. If you pop it into full mode, then it's all over to you. There we go.
All right. So my paper is titled The Footsteps of Nature, How Shelley's Philosophy of Poetic Language is Revived in Middle-earth. As C.S. Lewis once noted, J.R.R. Tolkien's philology was influenced by Owen Barfield's book Poetic Diction, a work which attempted to demonstrate the power of the poetic word to manifest meaning. However, there are broad strokes of both Tolkien's and Barfield's belief that can be traced further back to the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, particularly his essay titled A Defense of Poetry, a work which Poetic Diction references. Furthermore, we have strong evidence that Tolkien had read the essay and owned it, for it was part of a list of texts selected by him and Lewis for an honors examination in English language and literature. Though non-religious, Shelley nevertheless adopted a deeply spiritualist account of the universe by fashioning Berkeleian idealism and Platonism into a philosophy of poetry, focusing on the ways poetry might create meaning. Interestingly, Tolkien espoused many strikingly similar ideas with a more religious overtone, ideas which found expression in both his legendarium and his essay. In this paper, I wish to explore Shelley's philosophy of language and how it echoes in Tolkien's mythology, particularly in the music of the Ainulindalë and the poetry of Tom Bombadil. In doing so, my intent is to show that Tolkien continues the Romantic response to the Enlightenment, but in his own key. Ultimately, both he and Shelley turned to poetry as a higher vehicle for knowledge and meaning. Are you still able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. My computer was looking a little odd. Okay. So before looking more closely at the philosophical underpinnings of Shelley's essay, I wish to give perhaps the clearest illustration of the overlap between Shelley and Tolkien. In what follows, I will retell the Ainulindalë primarily by using quotations from A Defense of Poetry, showing that it is difficult to tell where Shelley ends and Tolkien begins. Before anything else was made, Eru, the universal mind from whom all other minds have their source, created the Ainur. To them, Eru propounded themes of music, which they sang back to him. This great music's gentle and exalted content extended itself over all the thoughts and actions of the Ainur, enlarging the circumference of their imaginations by replenishing them with thoughts of ever new delight. Thus the Ainur became the poets and inventors of Middle-earth, and at the beginning their song was the echo of the eternal music. They were nightingales in the void, singing as men entranced by the melody of an unseen musician, who feel that they are moved and softened, yet know not whence or why. As long as their thoughts were assimilated to the mind of Eru, expressing his poetry with harmonies like a prismatic and many-sided mirror that reflects and splinters rays of light, their song was one of glory and splendor, endowed with the power of propagating Eru's great beauty wherever the song might fall. Sadly, one of the Ainur, Melkor, was not content with the great music, wishing to enlarge the limits of his own power over the external world. While he had been given by Eru the greatest measure of power and knowledge among all of the Ainur, he was lacking in the poetical faculty. This faculty wishes to turn all things to loveliness and exalt the beauty of that which is most beautiful. However, being circumscribed by his desire for individual selfhood, Melkor began to sing obscenity rather than harmony, to weave blasphemy against the divine beauty as he raged against the great music. But the great music could not be overcome, for it turns all things to loveliness. Ainulindalë rose and sang new themes amidst Melkor's storms, for none may alter the music in his despite. The great music of Eru adds beauty to that which is most deformed, and subdues to union under its light yoke all irreconcilable things. By the power of its secret alchemy, it can take the blasphemous themes of the enemy and turn the poisonous waters which flow from death into something good. The great music, once sung, had real existence in the mind of both Eru and the Ainur. Though the world about which they sang had yet to be achieved on our plane of existence, this world nevertheless existed as the growing and flowering of thought in the timeless halls. Thus the forms of Middle-earth were coming to exist as they were being perceived in the minds of the Ainur. All that then remained was for the Ainur to take leave of Ainulindalë and descend into the world to shape it. The great music had already sent forth the evanescent hues of Middle-earth, waiting for the Ainur to fashion it and make it firm. As you can see, Shelley and Tolkien both explored very similar ideas about language, meaning, and the creative or sub-creative faculty of the human self. What I now wish to explain are the underpinnings of Berkeleian idealism and how it was reimagined by Shelley in order to resist the encroaching tide of materialism of the 19th century, an impulse which also motivated Tolkien in the wake of 2 world wars. What Berkeleian idealism allowed Shelley to do was to emphasize the reality of the spiritual, particularly the human spirit, and its role in giving us knowledge of the phenomenal world, the world beyond our material senses. While Shelley wanted to eliminate Berkeley's God from his framework, replacing him with the universal mind, Tolkien recovered a distinctively theistic version of idealism. However, both writers expressed a kind of annihilation of radical selfhood in favor of a harmonious union with the transcendent in order to come to a knowledge of reality. So to understand this philosophy, 3 terms are important to define. The first being epistemological idealism, the belief that objects in the world can only be expressed as ideas in the mind, and that we do not have access to things as they are in themselves, only our ideas of them. This is slightly different than the stronger form of ontological idealism, the one espoused by Berkeley, which affirms that all objects only exist as ideas and have no noumenal existence beyond those ideas we perceive. Related to this is Platonism, which maintains that there exist everlasting and unchanging forms hidden beyond our ordinary perceptions. For Shelley in particular, the ordinary objects in creation we perceive as ideas are merely shadowy substances and not spiritual essences of these forms. This version of Platonism articulated by Shelley is implicitly Berkeleian in that the natural objects we perceive are a kind of language of ideas that we learn to read. However, unlike Berkeley, Shelley maintains that one might be able to read past these ideas and see beyond physical matter and the confines of life and peek into the infinite forms of ideality, accessing the Platonic forms themselves. This ontological framework underpins Shelley's philosophy of making meaning with language, which Shelley takes up at length in A Defense of Poetry. While Shelley agrees with Berkeley that the individual mind cannot create, but can only perceive impressions made on the organs of sense, he distinguishes between the activities of creating and making, affirming that the mind can engage in making by imaginatively synthesizing and organizing ideas derived from perception. This distinction is necessary for understanding how Shelley defines poetry more broadly as the expression of the imagination, an activity which is not restricted to writing in verse. For Shelley, both reason and imagination work together epistemically to give the mind knowledge. While reason is the contemplating of the relations between one's thoughts, imagination is the acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own light, composing from them, as from elements, other thoughts. I'll leave this quote up here for you to read, and I'm just going to comment on it. This quote here describes what Shelley labels the poetical faculty, which takes the ideas impressed upon the mind and from them creates new materials of knowledge and power and pleasure. Furthermore, this faculty works in conjunction with another faculty that he calls approximation to the beautiful, and these 2 faculties reproduce and arrange new materials of the imagination according to a certain rhythm and order, which may be called the beautiful and the good. Those who possess the ability to exercise these faculties to excess, Shelley calls poets. Such persons use words which are vitally metaphorical, marking the before unapprehended relations of things. Their language is the record of their apprehensions of the true and the beautiful, and in a word, the good, which exists in the relation, subsisting first between existence and perception, and secondly between perception and expression. To be a poet, then, is to be able to trace the same footsteps of nature impressed upon the various subjects of the world, and to manifest with the power of language the logos that lies beyond our ordinary perceptions. To one well acquainted with Tolkien's nonfiction, this theory should sound strikingly familiar to Tolkien's idea of subcreation. In fact, I would argue that one could use the term subcreation interchangeably with poetry in Shelley's essay, and the meaning of the essay would remain essentially the same. Farrelyn Fleiter has noted how Tolkien's philological research led him through science into art, and through art into an almost spiritual realm, wherein the word was the conveyor of primal truth, the magic vehicle not just of communication, but of communion between the human mind and the world outside it, including the mind that created all things. This led Tolkien to the belief that the imagination is the capacity to make ideas which possess the inner consistency of reality. Those who have a high degree of this capacity can, with greater vividness and strength, take the images of their perceptions and manifest them in art that bears the inner consistency of reality. This is what subcreation involves, whether it be manifested in poetry or prose, and the likeness of this activity to Shelley's definition of poetry is quite clear. Other unmistakable similarities between Shelley and Tolkien emerge when we compare Shelley's definition of poems with Tolkien's definitions of myths. Shelley defines a poem as images of life expressed in its eternal truth, and the creation of actions according to the unchangeable forms of human nature, as existing in the mind of the creator, which is itself the image of all other minds. A great poem may thus be said to participate in the eternal and the infinite, being a fountain forever overflowing with waters of wisdom and delight. This definition of poetry is echoed in Tolkien's discussion of myths, particularly in his assertion that myth-making is the most effective carrier of truth, for it is the business of working with images and forms, bypassing the dissecting intellect, i.e. reason, and illuminating the mind with long-ago truths of reality. In his letters, Tolkien makes the even stronger assertion that some truths, being once discovered through myth-making, can only be received in this mode from this point on. Before moving to my final example in Tolkien's Legendarium, I want to close this section with two highly Tolkien-esque quotes from Shelley himself. All high poetry is infinite. It is as the first acorn, which contained all oaks potentially. Veil after veil may be undrawn, and the inmost naked beauty of meaning never exposed. A great poem is a fountain forever overflowing with the waters of wisdom and delight. And after one person in one age has exhausted all its divine effluence with their particular relations enable them to share, another and yet another succeeds, and new relations are ever developed, the source of an unforeseen and unconceived delight. Or this one a little further on in the essay. Shelley says, poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and circumference of knowledge. It is that which comprehends all science, and that to which all science must be referred. It is at the same time the root and blossom of all other systems of thought. It is that from which all spring, and that which adorns all, and that which, if blighted, denies the fruit and the seed, and withholds from the barren world the nourishment and the succession of the scions of the tree of life. What were our consolations on this side of the grave, and what were our aspirations beyond it, if poetry did not ascend to bring light and fire from those eternal regions where the owl-winged faculty of calculation dare not ever soar? Such Tolkien-esque ideas abound throughout Shelley's essay, and I've only begun to scratch the surface in this paper. It would be an interesting experiment to test a mixture of quotes from Tolkien and Shelley and see if those acquainted with the former could tell the difference between the two writers. As a final example, I wish to briefly look at how Tom Bombadil exemplifies Shelley's philosophy. Whenever speaking of Tom Bombadil, one should tread lightly given Tolkien's own firm opinions on the uselessness of philosophizing about him. However, I think there is value in elaborating on the philosophy behind what Tolkien himself has said about this highly enigmatic character in one of his letters. Tolkien says, "I do not mean him to be an allegory, or I should not have given him so particular, individual, and ridiculous a name. But allegory is the only mode of exhibiting certain functions. He is then an allegory, or an exemplar, a particular embodying of pure, real, natural science. the spirit that desires knowledge of other things, their history and nature, because they are other, and wholly independent of the inquiring mind, a spirit coeval with the rational mind, and entirely unconcerned with doing anything with that knowledge. Zoology and botany, not cattle breeding and agriculture. In another letter, Tolkien insists that, despite the ridiculous name, Tom should be taken seriously and not laughed off as an old scamp. Therefore, to do Tom justice requires us to understand exactly what he exemplifies, and this becomes clear when we compare Tolkien's statements with Shelley's description of a true poet in A Defense of Poetry. In short, Tom can be understood as an exemplar of the ideal set forth by Shelley, in which the poetic faculty dominates the rational one, and the outcome of which is an individual who exhibits the beauty of nature, rather than enslaving it for his own machinations. Though Tom is not an old scamp, he nevertheless appears just so to the hobbits when they first hear him speak. Their initial impression is that his songs are merely nonsense, but later they wonder if perhaps he is actually speaking a language that they do not know, an ancient language whose words were mainly those of wonder and delight. This shift in their understanding comes after spending time in Tom's house, a place where singing was easier than talking, a place where Tom's stories seemed to take on a kind of real presence merely in the speech act of singing and speaking, which, by the way, is almost exclusively done in iambic pentameter. The way Tolkien describes it, it's as if stories played out before the mind's eye of each hobbit. For example, upon hearing Tom's stories of the Barrow Downs, the hobbits experienced a vision of things that took place of a great expanse of years behind them, a vision which faded once Tom's story ended. Their experience of Tom's speech and his seemingly absurd persona fits Shelley's description of poets of the highest class. A majestic form and graceful motions will express themselves through the most barbarous and tasteless costume. Few poets of the highest class have chosen to exhibit the beauty of their conceptions in its naked truth and splendor, and it is doubtful whether the alloy of costume, habit, etc., be not necessary to temper this planetary music for mortal ears. This planetary music is evocative of the great music of the Ainur, which we have seen had power to shape reality. This power seems to be possessed by Tom himself. Unlike Melkor, however, Tom does not use his songs to blaspheme against the divine beauty in life, nor does he wish to enslave and dominate. Compare Tolkien's description of Tom with Shelley's thoughts on the cultivation of more obscene arts. The cultivation of those sciences, which have enlarged the limits of the empire of man over the external world, has, for want of the poetical faculty, proportionally circumscribed those of the internal world, and man, having enslaved the elements, remains himself a slave. To what but a cultivation of the mechanical arts in a degree disproportioned to the presence of the creative faculty, which is the basis of all knowledge, is to be attributed to the abuse of all invention for abridging and combining labor, to the exasperation of the inequality of mankind. If the antithesis of the poetical faculty is the mechanical one, then Tom is the antithesis of Melkor. Whereas Melkor wished to use his power to enslave the world, Tom was the master of wood, water, and hill in a radically non-possessive way. He was master because he had full knowledge of the ancientness of the old forest. His songs sang of ancient starlight and strange regions of time beyond the memories and thoughts of the hobbits. As Shelley put it, poets like Tom use words to touch the enchanted chord and reanimate, in those who have ever experienced these emotions, the sleeping, the cold, the buried image of the past. Poetry thus makes immortal all that is best and most beautiful in the world. Finally, Tom's poetry is like Ilúvatar's in that he can subdue evil's drive to subjugate. When the hobbits are mere moments from being lost to the Barrow-wights, the mere utterance of the name Tom Bombadil births strength in Frodo's heart, for Tom's songs are stronger songs. Indeed, Tom's songs reflect Shelley's belief that poetry is a sword of lightning ever unsheathed, which consumes the scabbard which would contain it. His song dooms the Barrow-wights to lost and forgotten be, darker than the darkness, where gates stand forever shut, till the world is mended. In conclusion, Shelley's idealism and Tolkien's subcreative language are harmonious concepts that express similar ideas in differing keys. Both theories say something about the nature of reality and the power of words to shape it, as well as something about the spirituality of the self that was being neglected in their respective moments in the secular age. I will leave you with one final quote, one which, if I might guess, came straight up from Tolkien's own fairy stories rather than from Shelley. Shelley writes, "But poetry defeats the curse which binds us to be subjected to the accident of surrounding impressions. And whether it spreads its own figured curtain or withdraws life's dark veil from before the scene of things, it equally creates for us a being within our being. It makes us the inhabitants of a world to which the familiar world is a chaos. It reproduces the common universe of which we are portions and percipients, and it purges from our inward sight the film of familiarity which obscures from us the wonder of our being. It compels us to feel that which we perceive and to imagine that which we know. It creates anew the universe after it has been annihilated in our minds by the recurrence of impressions blunted by reiteration." While Shelley and the other romantics dusted off Berkeley's philosophy in their foray into a spiritualist investigation of the world they experienced, Tolkien took up quite similar ideas in his pursuit of understanding the subcreative faculty of beings made in the image of God, and how such beings might with minstrels sing and stir the unseen with a throbbing strain. Thank you.
That was super. Thank you so much, Bethany, for sharing and really digging into the parallels between Shelley and Tolkien. I'd never thought of Bombadil in relation to Shelley before, but we love Bombadil here. So, well, Sean's not here, so we love him. But yeah, that was a fascinating parallel. So thank you very much. We do have an online question straight away that I'm going to posed to you, and it seemed that it was your paper were reminding one or two members of the audience about Tom's Tales and Songs with the hobbits, that they create visions, and how that kind of links into Cammy's paper at the start of the seminar about portals. And so at the start of the day, and a day or portals. So about portals through songs and tales specifically, songs and tales as portals. And curious about what you think about that in relation to Shelley.
No, I agree. I think that's something that needs to be explored more. It's almost as if the songs and poems become performative objects or liturgical moments in the legendarium of Middle Earth, and what those affect and what those bring about. I think it's a really fascinating question. And I think Shelley is very illuminating on understanding kind of the similarities between Tolkien and Berkeley in particular, and how language can, manifest ideas and manifest meaning in that particular way.
Okay. Yeah, completely. So thank you. And do we have any questions in the room? Or any more online? Yes, Cammy.
Hi, Bethany. This is Cammie. I just have I think, a simple question about Shelley's use of the image and metaphor of the veil. I see it again and again, and I hadn't read his essay in a while, and I saw it again and again in your slides. So I think it might be a thing with him. So I wondered if you just wanted to explore it a bit more.
I agree. It comes up quite a bit in the essay, and I don't even feel like I was able to do it full justice in my presentation. But the veil seems to be that inability that we ordinarily experience of trying to get beyond what we think about reality versus what reality actually is, and whether or not language can help us penetrate that veil, particularly poetic language. And like I said earlier, and it's not just metrical language, but a kind of speech act that taps into getting beyond what we just ordinarily perceive and what's, behind reality. And that's where the Berkeleian idealism comes in. Shelley did not fully accept like the explicit Berkeleian idealism. And so reading the essay is helpful to kind of see the differences between those two things. One of the books that I referenced heavily also explains this more. It's by Chris Townsend, George Berkeley and Romanticism. He talks a lot about this too. So if you're curious, I would definitely look at that book. It's an excellent book.
Okay, and we have another question online. So, do we know much about Owen Barfield's thoughts in particular on Shelley and how Shelley percolated through the Inklings more generally?
That's a good question, and one that I also wanted to explore more. In Poetic Diction, he referenced Shelley just a brief amount, and that's what first got Shelley's essay on my radar. And then once I read it, that's when I realized how close he was to Tolkien. So it seems that he did percolate, even if it was subconsciously through their workings and through their writings. But as to just how much, I can't say for certain.
Okay, well, there you go. You got research potential there. So, do we have any final questions for Bethany at all? No. Okay. Right. In that case, can we please give Bethany a final round of applause for her fantastic paper?